What's up, PAX East? What is up, PAX East? Thursday, guys, we gotta be pumped. Another day of PAX, oh my goodness. I'm happy that you're all here. Thank you for coming. Let me introduce myself. My name is Suduiko. I'm the founder and chief video game analyst at With the Terrible Fate. Straw poll, has anyone here actually heard of us before? That's awesome. Wow, fantastic. We're pretty small, so it's cool that most of you have not. After this, you will have. We are an online publication that's dedicated just to analyzing and trying to better understand and appreciate the storytelling of video games. That is the one thing that we do, and we're stoked to be here talking with you at PAX about one of the series that we run on the site, now loading the video game Canon. I'm here with my colleagues who will introduce themselves later, but we've got Dan Hughes here, Skylar Cohen, Richard Nguyen, and Matt McGill, all video game analysts for the site, and Dan runs this series. So this is what the next hour or so is going to look like. First, I'm going to be talking about what it means to be thinking about canons in the context that we are, and why we think that's especially important for talking about video games at this moment. That'll take about 15 minutes, and after that, Dan's going to chat with you for about 15 minutes of the nuts and bolts of how he actually goes about in practice deciding whether or not a video game belongs in this video game canon that we're trying to build. And then, in the back half of the presentation, everyone's going to come on up here, and it's going to be a discussion-style panel where we're actually going to have you all vote on one of 10 games that we've brought, and we want to discuss one of them as a candidate for admission into the canon. So that'll be somewhere between a lively conversation and a violent debate. I'm excited to get to that. But before we talk about whether or not a certain game belongs in the canon, we got to understand what a canon is. And this is actually pretty important and not mere semantics, because it turns out that there's a very common usage of canon out there in conversations about video games and fiction quite generally right now that has nothing to do with what we're talking about when we say video game canon. The thing that we're not doing is talking about a canon of events. So some of you might be familiar with what this is. What is it? Someone shout it out. There you go. You guys know. Yeah, I can't teach you anything. That is the timeline that Nintendo put out as part of the Hyrule Historia back in 2011, telling gamers basically the way in which all of the games in the expansive series are related to each other chronologically. This is a classic example of what it is for there to be a canon of events. When people say is X event canon in a series, what they oftentimes are saying is something along the lines of, has the creator of the series officially endorsed that this event happened in the world of the series? This is nothing at all like what we're talking about when we're talking about video game canon. We're thinking about a canon of works. What does that mean? If any of you have ever taken like a great books course in high school or college or what have you, you were probably exposed to at least some of what's known as the Western literary canon. This is the kind of thing that we're talking about. We're talking about the set of works with which you need to be familiar in order to really understand and appreciate something. In this instance, a lot of professors at least would tell you that you need to be familiar with works like the Odyssey and Inferno and Ulysses in order to really understand what's going on in literature. Not just because they advanced what it was to tell a story in literary form, but also because many of these authors were responding to each other. So Ulysses, for example, has clear references, allusions, and responses to all of the works that you see before it on the slide. Right? And so to really understand sort of the arc of history as literature is developed, we need to have familiarity with this canon. Just so, when we talk about building a video game canon on the site and on this panel today, we're talking about trying to build basically just a list of video games that have made central contributions to the storytelling of video games as a medium. Because again, many different ways you can play video games, but we're interested in them as a storytelling medium. Why would this matter, and why would it be good to think about things in terms of canons? Quite generally, before we think about a video game canon, all right? It's important to recognize that thinking about something in terms of a canon is a perspective, right? And like any perspective, there are pros and cons to it, and we need to recognize those and go into it with our eyes open. The pros basically all boil down to the idea of reference points. When you're trying to understand something, it's really helpful to have a commonly understood wealth of background knowledge by which you can relate to any new instances of that thing, right? And this comes across in canons through a couple of different ways. So suppose you're talking about a game with other people. right? You just picked up the newest game and you're trying to discuss it with a friend of yours. Maybe your friend hasn't even played it and you're trying to tell them what it's like. Really easy to get into that conversation if you're familiar with the same games and you can say, oh yeah, its gameplay is like that really famous game that we both played, or at least have some familiarity with. Its characters are, basically taken from this other game, etc., etc. When you have those reference points, you can have more productive conversations instead of just saying, dude, you should play this game. Which I also often say, but we need to go beyond that is the idea. You can also have reference points just to better understand your own relationship with games. So I don't know about you all, but at least for me, when I'm playing a game for the first time, I often have really visceral reactions to content in the game. So, I'll be playing a game and say, oh man, I just hate this aspect of it. The gameplay really sucks. Or I'll say, oh, I love what happened with this twist in the plot here. And that's great, but as people who are interested in better understanding and appreciating video game stories, it's natural and I think important to ask the follow-up question, well, why is it that I had such a strong reaction to this particular aspect of the game, right? And again, when you have reference points, it's much easier to do that. Oh, I hated that gameplay because it basically just stole this gameplay system from another really popular game, but the balance was off and so it ended up just being complete garbage. Oh, this plot twist was really interesting because it took sort of a really common style of plot from like the Final Fantasy series or something, but did something new and interesting with it. And then, of course, it can help you to better understand other works. So go back to the idea of the literary canon that I was telling you about. The works did not exist in a vacuum, right? Like I said, Joyce was aware of and responding to these authors who came before, right? It's very tempting when we pick up a video game to think of it as kind of the first video game we've ever played, right? And just judge it in a vacuum based on whether or not we like it. But oftentimes, developers who are plugged into the game community, they make games, right, are aware of and responding to particular aspects of really well-known games that came before, right? And so if we have a sense of which games have made which contributions to the storytelling of the medium over the years, we can actually better understand what's at work when a developer, has a really interesting comment or twist that's responsive to something in the overall medium. Those are the pros, right? Obviously, we think they're pretty good pros if we're running this whole series trying to do this enterprise of building a video game canon, but there are also cons, right? And if you've encountered canons in school or elsewhere, the pros are pretty well, the pros are the focus, right? But the cons are maybe even more important to emphasize, which is that canon thought kind of inherently is exclusive in at least two senses, right? So as soon as you're saying that certain games belong in a video game canon, you're saying that other works do not belong in the canon, right? On the one hand, there's nothing inherently judgmental about that, I don't think. Just because some works have made central contributions to the storytelling of video games, that doesn't mean that other games therefore do not have value, but it's really easy if you're not careful about this to just kind of tacitly assume that any work that does not count as advancing video game storytelling in a landmark way, therefore is not worth playing. And so we need to avoid that and be aware of that danger. Similarly, but different, when you're thinking about a work that is admitted to the canon, right, it's very easy to end up ignoring other aspects of it if you're just focused on video games as a storytelling object, right? So I told you before, we care on the site about the storytelling of video games. Video games can do a lot of other things, right? They can be a cool social thing to do with your friends. They can be mere entertainment. They can teach people things, right? And if you're just focused on building a storytelling canon, those other functions can kind of fall away, right? So if you're not actively thinking about those other functions, you can end up ignoring other really interesting aspects of video games. I actually think, we'll get into this a bit more later, that the response to this is not to say, okay, we shouldn't think in terms of canons, but rather that we need to think in terms of multiple canons, all right? We need a canon of games that, contributed to the social aspect of games in landmark ways, for example, or games that advance the concept of video games as learning mechanisms, things like this, and I think that'll help avoid that issue. So that was thinking about canon thought quite generally, right? I also think, like I alluded to earlier, that there are reasons why at this particular point in the history of video games, we ought to start thinking more in terms of canons. I'm going to discuss 3 of them briefly for you. So, since you're at PAX, you've probably read at least something from at least one of the kind of glob of sites on the right. I actually quite like these sites, and I think they do good work, so I don't want to be saying that there's no value in them, but I do think that there is oftentimes a clear and present danger about the way in which they review games and think about the value of video games. So I'm going to paint for you something of a caricature of the kind of review you would see on a lot of these sites, but I think there's some truth in it. Oftentimes, when a reviewer from this sort of site reviews a game, they'll break it down into a few constitutive components, right? Things like gameplay, things like story, things like replay value, right? And then when it comes time to give the game a rating, right, and say, this is how good this game is, we'll kind of just average those scores together and say, this is the value of the game. The game is a 9 out of 10, or the game is a 7 out of 10, and leave it at that. I think that's deeply misguided, and actually when you think about it, a little bit incoherent. This is why. Like I just mentioned to you before, video games have all sorts of functions that they can serve, right? Video games can tell a story, they can entertain you, etc., etc. And it turns out that if you're thinking about the value of any given object, right, different things can count as contributing to or detracting from its value based on the function that you're intending it to serve, right? Let me give you a completely non-video game related example to show you what I mean. Imagine that you have a knife, right? And I ask you the question, is this a good knife? Here are two different functions that knives can serve, right? Either, they can cut food in a kitchen setting, or, oftentimes they have a ceremonial function. In rituals, you can have ceremonial knives, right? Here's a pretty plausible idea about knives that are served in rituals, right? You don't want them to be that sharp, right? Because unless it's some sort of weird, archaic bloodletting ritual, you probably don't want to get cut while you're performing, okay? On the other hand, say you're cutting up meat in a kitchen, it had better be the case that that knife is sharp, right? So, again, I ask you, hey, is this a good knife? And, well, from what I've just said, sharpness is going to be a factor in whether or not that knife is good, but notice that it's going to serve exactly opposite purposes in those two functions. Either if it's a really sharp knife and you're intending to cut food with it, then it's a really good knife. But if it's a ceremonial knife, that sharpness is going to actually make it pretty bad at its function, right? So, kicking back to video games, I think that by lumping all of the different functions that video games can serve into this kind of conglomerate of the singular value of a video game, you end up doing something that's ultimately incoherent. You end up saying that there's some kind of function out there that combines all of the functions a video game can be, instead of simply thinking about how well a video game succeeds at serving a single function, right? And I think that by thinking about canons, which again focus on video games according to a particular function, we can actually end up having more coherent understanding of the various aspects of a video game that contribute to something like storytelling or entertainment or video games as a learning mechanism, because we're not trying to evaluate everything the video game can do at once, we're thinking about a precise function. That's one. The second reason why it's pretty important right now, I think, in video game discourse to introduce this kind of canon thought, is that especially in regard to video game storytelling, the tools we have for even talking about the stories of video games are pretty imprecise. Show of hands, game feel, has anyone heard this term before? Yeah, you have, all right, and I know some of you just aren't paying attention or something, so we mostly have. Game feel, right, it's a term that is actually used and thrown around, not just in reviews of video games, but also in design rooms, when people are making games. This is a notion, right, but the more you ask yourself, all right, what is it that actually constitutes game feel? This idea that, a game just kind of feels natural and immersive when you're playing it. The more you think about the precise elements of that, the more, I think at least, it becomes clear that we just don't yet have a firm understanding on the most basic elements of video game storytelling. And that's okay to be expected, by the way, because video games are still a very young medium. Our discourse about video games is even younger. So it's exciting that we can start to think about a more robust language for understanding them, but I don't think we're there yet, and I think that, again, focusing on a specific function of video games through the lens of a canon can help us get there. Last example, or last reason, rather, why I think it's important that we think about video game storytelling through the lens of a canon. On with the terrible fate, like I said, we're really interested in video game storytelling. Video game storytelling in the sense that we often try to answer the question, what are video games as a medium either uniquely able to do in storytelling, or at least especially well suited to do, in contrast with other storytelling media, such as film, or a novel, or a play, or what have you. And to answer that question, once again, I think we need a more precise understanding of what the elements of video game storytelling are, and how they are distinct from the elements of other storytelling media. As an example, who's played Spec Ops: The Line? Good, that's a good sample. You all should. It'll mess you up for months afterwards, but it's really good. Critics thought it was really good too. They really liked it, they thought its story was really interesting, and a generally good story. But here's a fact about Spec Ops: The Line. Its story was based on the story of Apocalypse Now, a film, which in fact borrowed its own story from Heart of Darkness, a novel. So here's a question that you can ask. Did Spec Ops: The Line succeed in telling a good story just because it kind of accessed this great story that'll work super well in any medium? Or rather, was it the case that Spec Ops succeeded in telling an interesting and compelling kind of story that could really only work in that form of a video game, right? And I think to be able to answer that question, we need a better understanding of exactly what's going on in video game storytelling, and that's what we can do by thinking about a canon. Before we move on to Dan talking about the actual articles he writes deciding whether or not games belong in a canon, and to the subsequent discussion, I want to just emphasize that the goal here is not ultimately to etch into stone the games that you must play in order to have a valid opinion on the medium. That's nonsense, that's exclusionary to the nth degree, and it is the last thing we want. Rather, like I said before, thinking about video game storytelling in terms of a canon is a perspective that we can take to start to have better, more robust conversations about video games and enrich everyone's understanding of what it is for a video game to tell a great story, right? So you should not feel as if this kind of project has failed if you start talking with your friends about which games belong in the video game canon and you end up disagreeing with them, right? As long as you're able to start pointing to more specific and better defined aspects of a game's story and say, look, I think this game did something that's really interesting. What do you think of this? And look at all of these other games that picked up on it, and look how it was relating to games that came before. That kind of conversation has already gotten us a little bit further down the path of better appreciating and understanding video games as a storytelling medium. And that kind of conversation is the only kind of thing that we're really aiming to facilitate with this series and with thinking about canons and video games more generally. So with that little preamble, I'm going to turn it over to Dan, and he's going to talk to you a bit more about the nuts and bolts of how he actually goes about this project I've laid out for him.
Thank you, Aaron. What an attractive audience we have today. So yes, my name is Dan Hughes. I run, we'll just let that go, I guess. I run the series now loading the video game canon on With a Terrible Fate. Before I get into sort of the methods I use to construct an article, and looking at one in particular, I do want to emphasize, or re-emphasize, the point that Aaron just made that, now look folks, I don't want to be a gatekeeper any more than you want me to be a gatekeeper. So I'm not going to be standing up here and telling you which games are judged this way or that. Of course, I do have a verdict at the end of most of the articles. All of the articles, in fact. But that doesn't mean that the conversation is closed. In fact, that's sort of what I hope to be the hook to get everyone else involved in the conversation and start talking about games and arguing about them in a meaningful way. So, before we get into the nitty-gritty here, I have my main man, Dante Alighieri, up there, a picture of the Divine Comedy. How many folks have read the Divine Comedy or maybe Inferno? Oh, fantastic. This is lovely. Okay, so when Aaron and I were coming up in our respective colleges, we sort of fortuitously both read Inferno, the first part of the Divine Comedy, at the same time. And, you know, we consider ourselves to be sort of fairly intelligent people. And we had what turned into a long-standing joke between us that, hey, this Dante guy really knows what he's talking about. Which seems like a silly thing to say, right? Especially because Dante Alighieri and his works are considered classics. I mean, they persisted for centuries upon centuries. They've influenced other works from different novels to different poetry, music, movies, what have you, video games even, right? So why does it feel weird to say, oh yeah, it's actually pretty good, that classic? I think it's because we often kind of take classics for granted. I have 3 other mugs up there, Billy Shakes, Alfred Hitchcock. I think that these people have all inarguably contributed to their various fields. We all know their work in one way or another. It's sort of infiltrated every facet of culture, whether it be English or movies or music. And when we think about these guys, it's usually in terms of a statement, which is, of course it's good, it's a classic. Of course, right? And I think that that does these guys and their work a big disservice, because it basically shelves them away and takes a conversation away from all of us. Once we say something like, oh yeah, it's great, it's a classic, it kind of stops us from talking about why it's so great. So instead of saying that, I think we should instead be asking, what about this work is so good that we call it a classic, right? So, to bring it into the realm of video games, I'm going to be talking about The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time. Anyone heard of that game? No. Oh, okay. Savage. So, I think that this is absolutely a classic. I think that most of you will agree with me. And those of you who disagree with me, I think have very vehement arguments that you'd like to get out as well. But the fact of the matter is, this game is sort of taken for granted as a classic. It still holds the Guinness World Record for the most highly ranked game. We have 99% still holding on Metacritic and GameFAQs for what they're worth, hopefully a lot, because it's our community, right? It's widely considered to be one of, if not the best Zelda title, and if not that, then it's certainly considered to be the title that all of the preceding titles were modeled after, right? But the question remains, why is this game praised so highly, and does it deserve all that praise? Does it really deserve to be called a classic? Well, that's where our series, Now Loading the Video Game Canon, comes in, where we take a look at different aspects of the game and really dig down deep into what makes it good or what makes it bad, and open up a conversation and an argument. So, in the interest of time, as Aaron mentioned, I think it would also be a great idea to have a multitude of canons, especially because games are so multifaceted. But I'm a story lover. We like to focus on the storytelling power of video games on the website. And so in the articles, I do mandate in the structure that there is talk of gameplay, visuals, music, impact on gaming culture, the history of the development. We really do a deep dive, but for the sake of brevity today, I'm just going to be focusing on the storytelling aspect. And so we're just going to be looking at story, characters, and theme of Ocarina of Time. So, how many of you are familiar with this cycle or Joseph Campbell, The Hero's Journey? Great, it's a trick question. You're all familiar with it. To go back to Dante's Inferno, Dante Alighieri's Inferno, part of the Divine Comedy. That is in itself a hero's journey, as is the Divine Comedy as a trilogy. Man enters a foreign environment, gets presented with a lot of change, has to overcome certain things in his own mind, or physically, depending on what's going on at the time, and then comes out the other side a changed person, having learned something. The world has irrevocably changed, and he goes home, but he's different, right? That's essentially the cycle up there. Now, a more colloquial and sort of thing that we might all be more aware of is Star Wars. Star Wars was written and directed by George Lucas directly based on this cycle here. He said it many times. He owes a great deal to our good pal Josie Cams. So, the great thing about Ocarina of Time is that it is a reenactment of Joseph Campbell's monomyth in video game form. Now, I am not saying by any means that it is the only one, nor am I saying by any means that it is the only one doing this in the series of The Legend of Zelda, right? Most games, most stories follow this cycle. So by no means is it doing anything brand new and original. However, I think you'll find that through the arguments I pose, it is doing something interesting with it. So let's take a look at the characters for a second. So we're all fairly familiar with Ocarina of Time, so we are familiar with sort of the story, basically. You have Link, who has to save Zelda from Ganondorf. That's essentially the story of every Zelda game. This one, there's a bit more details lost in the mix, but essentially that's what it revolves around. So we have these three characters. Now the thing about Joseph Campbell and the monomyth is that he posited that the monomyth and the hero's journey existed across all cultures, across all religions, across all creeds, races. This is a story that comes out all across the world and all across different timescapes. And nowhere is that more apparent than with the characters in Ocarina of Time. They sort of represent this thing up there, the living Triforce, the Triforce being of power, wisdom, and courage. They all sort of represent a different trait. And through their actions, these characters, we see the amazing heights to which these traits can be used, and we also see the follies. For example, Ganondorf, King of All Evil, it's a bad title to be sacked with, but there it is. He has the trait Power, which, as we all know, is an incredible tool to be used. It can create, but it can also destroy, and in worst cases, it can corrupt and devastate, right? Then we also have Zelda, representing wisdom. Now, wisdom can lead you to solve problems. It can make you think back on certain times in your life with reverence or awe or embarrassment, as Zelda does, right? I mean, the story of Ocarina of Time essentially is all her fault because of her arrogance, and that's the downfall of wisdom. But she kind of turns it around at the end for those of us who've finished it, right? And then you have Link, who is the avatar of courage. We don't know much about Link. He's a silent kind of guy. He doesn't really talk much. We know that he's a bit of an outsider. He doesn't belong anywhere where he's from. But we know that he's courageous. We know that he's brave, right? But there's a fourth character amidst the larger cast, and that's the player character. How does our influence in the game manifest itself? Well, let's take a look back at Link. So Link is a silent hero, a silent protagonist, a term I'm sure you're all familiar with, especially if you like Zelda and Nintendo games writ large. Now, the cool thing about silent protagonists, especially in video games, is that because they don't have intrusive thoughts or feelings being conveyed to the player is able to sort of put themselves in the avatar's shoes, right? You're sort of primed to believe that you are this character that you're controlling. And in this way, you are sort of this avatar of courage. Much like Link is going out there and fighting all these monsters, you're picking up the controller, you're going in and doing all the different puzzles, you're fighting monsters, you're facing your fears, whether you indulge in them or not, right? And so, because you're primed to believe that you are, in effect, this hero character, you're the one who gets sent out by the Great Deku Tree. You're the one who picks up the Master Sword and changes his life irrevocably. And you're the one who fights against the great King of Evil at the end, changing the world and returning to a home that doesn't really exist anymore. So, what this all amounts to is that every character moment, every beat, every scene, everything in Ocarina of Time, specifically with Link's character and how you're primed to assume the role of this courageous hero, is all in service of reinforcing heroism. You're not just witnessing a hero's journey like you are with Star Wars, or like you're reading in Inferno. You're experiencing it. So, in this way, I'm going to go back to Aaron's example about Spec Ops and Apocalypse Now. So, Spec Ops is a retelling of Apocalypse Now, which is in itself a retelling of Heart of Darkness. Why should we have all these retellings? Well, Heart of Darkness is brilliant, right? But the idea that you have when you're reading it may be vastly different from someone else's. Add on the visceral language of film, and somehow it changes, right? Then, add in the personal experience of a video game, and not only are you seeing all of the horror, but you're experiencing it too. To use a cheerier example, we'll turn back to Ocarina of Time, and how everything in the game presents you with this opportunity to become a hero. You are reenacting this monomyth. You're going on this adventure for yourself, and attaching yourself, and thereby attaching yourself to the game and its characters. So, in my mind, not only does Ocarina of Time deserve the title of a classic, but it deserves to be looked at over and over and over again from many different facets. There's a reason it's regarded so highly, and I don't think it's just hype, as I've just explained. I think that there's a lot going on in this game, and it deserves to be talked about and not shelved by just saying, oh, of course it's a classic. We don't need to talk about it anymore. It's fantastic, right? So, with that in mind, I'm going to turn it over to our illustrious panel. We're also going to do the vote here now, and hopefully this link will work for us. If not, we'll just resort to hands and cheering.
Will it work as well as the link in Ocarina of Time?
Good one. There's the groan.